So firstly, thank you all for coming. I didn't expect such a huge crowd, so this is very exciting. I'm going to be sharing with you today some improv techniques in the hopes of maybe dispelling two rumors about improv. One, that it's just a whole bunch of fabric thrown together with very little thought, and two, that everything is wonky. Hopefully by the end of this little demonstration, you'll see that both of those things are not true. I'm also very excited. I don't know if we have any Tula Pink fans in the audience, but I'm very excited to be sewing on the new Bernina Special Edition Tula Pink, which has this lovely oil slick finish, so that's very exciting. So as I said, two improv techniques. Just a little bit of background before we start. So I've been quilting for about 6 years now, 6 or 7 years. When I started, I was very traditional, so I learned a lot from books and from online blogs, YouTube videos that other quilters had uploaded, and I kind of did things by the book, let's say, as you know, as quilters we're taught to do this and this in this particular way, and I did that for a long time, and whilst I enjoyed the process of sewing, I didn't really enjoy what I was making. So I would quickly finish a project, move on to something else, and maybe not even see the project through to completion. I then stumbled across a picture, and this is where it gets a little bit weird, so just bear with me, but I stumbled across a picture of a leek in a magazine supplement for a recipe. And it had a picture of a leek that had been cross-cut, so you could see the layers within that leek. And in that moment, I was just sort of really captivated by the pattern and the texture that I found within that vegetable. And I just wanted to find some way to sort of replicate that into fabric, as it were. And I knew that there wasn't going to be a quilt block out there, or a traditional quilt block, let's say, that would allow me to do that. So I went home, I raided the scrap box, got a bunch of green fabric, and kind of just started experimenting and piecing things together. And that led on to my love of improv quilting. And I kind of credit that quilt, which I call my vegetable patch quilt, as being the sort of genesis of my improv journey. So we've come a long way from there now, and pretty much improv quilting is what I do exclusively now. So what I want to share with you is two techniques that I think if you're new to improv, you're scared of improv, or you've got sort of questions about improv, these two techniques are great to have in an improv toolkit, as it were. They're easy, they're adaptable, they can be adjusted to suit whatever you're making, be it a table runner or a cushion cover or a quilt. Easy to scale up and down, and really good to sort of get you into that improv way of sewing and that more liberated approach. So we're going to start with what I think is my favorite, and I call that just improv triangles. So triangle is a popular shape in patchwork. We all know about half square triangle. We've all seen the many different ways of creating them. And I did actually, one of my first quilts was a half square triangle quilt. But I got so obsessed with points meeting and the precision of everything. Because I'm a perfectionist, I think that it's better for me to go completely to the other end of the spectrum and have points not meet and kind of be a bit more organic. And I feel happier then with what I'm creating. So I've kind of devised a technique to make triangles in a way that suits me and my sewing. And essentially they are just little triangle units like this. So there's no right or wrong size. They can be big, they can be tall. The background can be any fabric you want. You can mix solids, you can mix prints. It's great for scraps, it's great for cutting from yardage, if you've got an old charm pack, anything like that. It's all adaptable, and it is really the best introduction to improv piecing that I can give you. So as you can see, they're composed of two pieces, a background piece and a triangle piece. So what you want for your background pieces is lots of nice chunks of fabric. And you'll notice that I don't give any specific measurements, and even in the book, the cutting list is very limited. And that is intentional. It's not like I forgot to write it. It's just that with improv, there's no specifics, as it were. So for your background for your triangles, you want nice variation, lots of square-ish pieces that you can put a triangle into. You'll notice that some of these have odd bits sticking out from the end. These aren't necessarily cut with a rotary cutter. And more often than not, if I find a fabric piece that might work, I'll reach for my scissors and just cut a chunk off before I reach for my ruler and rotary cutter. So you want to amass a nice big collection of these that you can use for your background. For your triangles, name suggests triangles, and again, these can be any size. I like to have little packets of this sorted by color, so that if I want to make another triangle quilt, I know that I've got them good to go. And you can see the variation in those. So some are kind of tall and fat, and some are very small. A question I get asked a lot when I teach or talk is, oh, surely that should be in the bin. You can't possibly use that. But I don't think I've come across a scrap from a previous project that's been too small for anything I've done in another one. So I would always say, not that I'm encouraging you to keep every bit of fabric, but things like this can be used, and they are handy, and they don't take up a great deal of space, so just pop those to one side. So you've got your background, and you've got your triangle. So to make the triangle unit, you want to place your background fabric right side up on your cutting mat, take the triangle that you've chosen, and put that right side up on top of the background fabric. This is not square, and it may not necessarily be straight. What you want to remember is, when we eventually sew this into a completed quilt, and after the demo, I'd encourage you just to go to that side of the stand, because I've got one of the triangle quilts up there and you can see. But when we sew this into something, not only are we going to lose some of the fabric when we straighten that edge up, but we're also going to lose our classic 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So what you don't want, unless that's the look you're going for, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but just remember that if you position that triangle too close to that edge, when you come to piece that into a unit or a larger block, you will lose a little bit of that triangle. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, and you will see that some of that in that quilt over there. But for this demo, we'll just go straight in the middle like that. Right sides up, and I find something like this is very handy. This is a 6.5 or, oh no, 11, sorry, beg your pardon, 11 by 1 inch ruler, which is really handy for small units. A lot of the things I make start off as quite small units, so I don't want to pull out my big 6 by 24 inch ruler. I want to just use something that's a little bit easier to manage. And I've just realized in my preparation I haven't put a blade in my rotary cutter, so that's always a good start. So we'll just quickly do that now. See, I came prepared with new blades, but just didn't get a chance to put one in. So I just... There we go. So, yes, a ruler like this, if you can get one, and we're better to find one than somewhere like this, is really handy for these small units. So I've got my background piece, I've got my triangle right sides up. I'm right-handed, so if you're left-handed, you may want to flip this, but I have taught left-handed students who do it this way as well. My ruler then goes on the right-hand side of my triangle, and I cut that line of the triangle in. And I will lift this up so you can all see it. So essentially what I've done is cut the triangle like that. I then take this triangle piece and flip it so that it is right sides together on that right-hand side of the background fabric. We then pick this up and take it to the machine, and I'm just going to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam to attach that triangle to that first side of the background fabric. Now, there may be some people in the crowd who are going to gasp in horror at the next thing I say, but a 1/4 inch seam in my style of quilting and piecing is not very important. I mean, it is important, but if you find that it's not exact or it's wavered slightly, it's absolutely fine. We're not piecing things into a row, which then any sort of discrepancy in quilt seam allowance would multiply and make everything smaller or bigger. We don't know the size generally that these sort of quilts are going to be until we start piecing them all together. So if your 1/4 of an inch seam is slightly off, it's absolutely fine. You'll then end up with something like that. Now, normally I would press with an iron, and again, you may gasp in horror, but I actually iron as well. So I'm not lifting this up, I'm actually vigorously ironing. But essentially what you want to do is press that seam over, so you then have something that looks like that. We just now have to deal with this excess here. So while we take this ruler and pop it on the left-hand side and trim away this excess background fabric. So we're following the line of the triangle, trimming away that piece there. And what we're left with is what I like to call a bonus triangle. So that would then go into the pile, and it's reduce, reuse, reduce, recycle. You're left with something that looks like that. Now here's the cool bit. If you're using a solid background piece, so like I am here, you can now take the left-hand side and just flip it over. And that magically now fits. So when it was the right side up, when we cut it, it did not fit. Now we can flip that and it now fits. If you were using a print background fabric, you can't do that because obviously you've got the wrong side. So what I would say is if you wanted to use print background pieces, just cut them a little bit wider. And then what that enables you to do is move this over and recut the line. But with solids, it's just as easy as flipping that. They now go right sides together, like that, and you're going to sew the seam in exactly the same way as you sewed the other seam. Just remembering that as you come to the triangle, you've got that seam where the first half was pieced in. So just be careful, slow down a little. And again, 1/4 of an inch is not so important. Cut my threads. I would then press this open. And that is how I make one triangle unit. Now, I'm not worried about this. I'm not worried about this. Sometimes some of my pieces even have the selvage edge still on. I'm very rough and ready when it comes to my quilting. And that would then just go in a pile, and I would repeat that a lot to make a lot more. People ask me at this stage, should they be concerned with squaring this up? I would say no, because again, you don't know where this is going to go into your finished composition. So if, for example, you said, oh, I will square that up now, I'll just, take off that much could be the difference of filling in a gap when you came to arrange them all. So what you want to do is just make a whole bunch of these triangle units like that. And that gives you the most freedom then to play with the layout of fitting them all together. And these are not going to come together as easily as your traditional blocks. We don't have a regular size. They're not all 12.5 inches. There is a little bit of work to be done. What I would say is a few things that will help you. If you're lucky enough to have the space to put a bit of wadding up on a wall to act as a design wall and give yourself a bit of distance from the pieces, that's brilliant because you can lay them all out. But essentially what you are doing is a giant jigsaw. You have all the pieces, you just don't have the box that shows you what it looks like when it's finished, which is a bit, can be a bit confusing. But you want to look for what I call groupings. So things that seem like they naturally want to go together. So if we take these two, for example, they're of a similar size. So we could straighten this edge, straighten that edge, and then sew those two pieces together, press that seam open, and we would have that. If, for example, then we had something that was almost as wide, we could then square that off and sew that. So you're building and building these blocks. So you're taking individual units into larger groups of units, reducing that down until you have one finished quilt top. Again, if you've never done improvised quilting before or never sewn in this way, this can seem a bit like, oh my God, this is very scary. But hopefully, just by seeing how easy these units come together, and once you've done one, you do 5, you do 10, you can even chain piece them. And I talk about in the book how to sort of chain piece. So you're not doing one individually. You can cut a whole bunch of units, get the triangles ready, stack them, feed them through the machine, and then flip them and do the other side. So they come together quite quickly, which is good news because, as we found, we lose a lot on the edge. So you do need quite a few of these to make up a full-size quilt. But that's how I approach triangles, and they're so versatile as well. We all have sort of different associations with shapes. So in the quilt around the corner, some people see Christmas trees, others see party hats, the rooftops of a village at midnight. People look at improvised quilts and kind of have their own take on what it might be saying or what it might be representing. So triangles for me is a brilliant introduction to this kind of odd world of liberated sewing. But hopefully now you've seen that it doesn't have to all just be, wonky. There is a structure, and you can make conscious choices in terms of fabric and color placement. I particularly like to work with color gradients, and you'll see that in the quilt and the one that's hanging in the modern category. I like to take lots of solids with subtle color differences and try and create a gradient throughout the quilt by using this particular technique. So I do hope that you'll give triangles a go. And then moving on to my second favorite, I shouldn't really have favorites, but I do have favorites, freehand curves. So a little background, when I first sewed a curve, I attempted a drunkard's path, which we all know. Some beautiful, beautiful examples, and I really, really wanted to try and do that. So I followed books, I followed YouTube tutorials, I followed online things, and I was talking about, they were telling me to pin every like 1/8 of an inch, or to glue baste, or to baste along the scant edge, and my mind was, for a newbie quilter, it's all this vocabulary. Well, my first attempt was disastrous. The curve ended here and there was this much left, and it was just a nightmare. So I wanted to kind of take my love of liberated sewing and apply that to something curved. So I like to approach curves in this sort of way, and I do have a quilt here. I'm not sure if you can see it, but that uses the freehand curve technique. So there's no pins, there's no basting, there's no glue, there's no notching, there's no clipping of seams. It's all just done sort of in a free improv way. And I have a technique that I kind of tweaked to be the best, I think, to do these curves that work for me. So with curves, you generally want to have longer pieces of fabric. So again, I very rarely use rulers or anything like that. If we just take these scissors, and I'm just going to cut a strip. And when I'm teaching this, this is where all the hands go up and they say, how long's the strip? How wide's the strip? So there is no right or wrong answer. What I would say is the wider you cut your strip, the deeper you can cut a curve. Because naturally, if you've only got that much, you can only ever go to that much of a curve. Remembering, like we did with the triangles, that you're going to lose some seam allowance when you sew it to its neighboring curve. So eclectic mix, I would say. Have variation, have some wide, have some slightly not so wide, just to give you a bit of a sort of organic approach. You wouldn't want everything to be the same. So once you've got a nice array of strips, like we did with the triangles, you're going to take 2. And again, these can be prints, solids, whatever you want. You're going to pop them right sides up on your cutting mat. And if one is slightly longer than the other, that's, don't take the time to trim them all, that's fine. And you want to overlap them, again, by an amount that is not defined. So depending on how wide you want that curve, if you knew that you wanted a very deep curve, you would overlap them more. If you wanted a shallower curve, you would overlap them less. It is trial and error, and it is something that you're just going to have to go for and try. Once you've done a few, you'll get to, familiarize yourself with how much it needs to be. But for now, we'll just go, and I've got that about 1 inch. We know how sharp these are. We've probably, well, hopefully you haven't, but I have caught myself with a rotary cutter, particularly when you've just changed the blade, as I have done. We're not using rulers, so there isn't that sort of stability there. We are cutting the curve freehand. So what I would say is, if you've never done that before, just take your time. You want this hand, I always have this hand here because I've done this a lot, as you can see. If you've never cut a freehand curve before, just get this hand out of the way, just for your first one. Even put it behind your back if you have to. I would hate to be the one who made you sort of slice your thumb or something. But essentially, you're going to not overthink this curve. The minute you start to think, oh, where am I going? That's when you become like this, you become rigid, it's all in your shoulders. You become hacking rather than a nice motion, and it just makes things worse. So What you want to do is try and cut the curve in one nice smooth motion. And what I'm going to do is just trim that a little bit, just so that you can see where the edge of the mat is. So, overlapped from the bottom, start off slow, and you're just going to cut a curve like that. Don't overthink it, just go with your arm, and what you'll be left with is something like that. And that's quite a subtle curve to start off with. You'll have two pieces of fabric that you need to discard, so they just go out like that. Now you're left with that. You now need to flip this top piece onto this, so they are now right sides together. And the classic mistake is aligning this top edge like that. Do not do that. What you want to align is the curve that you have cut. So in my case, because it started off quite shallow, I'm not sure if you can see on the TV, I've aligned this edge here, not the top edge. So because it's quite shallow, this curve, it does look almost that the top edge is aligned, but if I turn it around, it's not quite. So you want to align, always align this edge that you have cut. If your needle has the function to stop with the, if your sewing machine has the function to stop with the needle in the down position, now is a brilliant time to engage that. And what I also find useful is just to reduce my stitch length ever so slightly. So we're not talking, minuscule, just a little bit. Generally, we tend to sew at 2.5. I've taken mine down to 2.25. Just gives me a little extra stitch there on that seam. I pop the unit to be sewn under the presser foot, and I take 1 or 2 stitches. Now this machine actually has a locking stitch that I've engaged, so it's done 4 stitches very close together, and that's held that in place. And you can see that my needle is stopped in the down position, so there's no way of that fabric moving. You want to try and aim to sew the curve in one smooth motion. Like how we cut it, you want to translate that into the sewing of it and try and do it in one motion. If you have to stop, please do stop. I have people who are allowing the machine to run away with them because they feel they can't stop because I've said they have to sew it in one. That's an ideal scenario. If you need to stop, just please stop. But I'm, again, right-handed. 1/4 inch seam, even less important with the curves. I find that if you waver from that seam allowance slightly, you get a nice organic line on some of the pieced units. And just while we're mentioning 1/4 inch seam, I've said a lot of the times that it's not important. You wouldn't want it to be so small or so wide that it would sort of interfere with the integrity of the quilt. At the end of the day, you are joining pieces of fabric together and you want them to stay together. So when I say yes, a quilt seam is not important, obviously you don't want it to be tiny. If you're wavering slightly, that's fine. I'm right-handed, so as I said, I use my left hand to hold the top curve up away from the bottom fabric. And I move my left hand to make this edge match this edge. So my left hand is up and it's moving left to right. My right hand is guiding the bottom fabric to whatever means I'm using to create that 1/4 inch seam. So on this particular machine, I have a guide that's into my needle, into the bed of the machine, and I butt the fabric up against that. You may have a specific foot that has a guide, you may have a masking tape line, you may use the lines on your needle plate. Whatever means you use, just use this hand to keep the edge of the bottom piece up against that. And we're going to start slow and steady, holding this up, remember, guiding this to the 1/4 inch seam and bringing this one to meet. So I'll just start off. So this is up, and you can see, as I come to get that, I bring it over. I drag it over. So I'm always bringing the top piece over to the bottom piece. And then when it needs to come back, I'm just pulling it back. Always trying my very best to keep those two pieces aligned, like so. Left with something that looks like that. As we've said, this was quite a subtle curve. If this was a much deeper curve, this would look a lot more bunched up. And again, at this point, whenever I'm teaching curves, the students generally say, oh, that's terrible, that's never going to press flat, it's never going to, I'll have to clip the seam. I have never clipped a seam for a curve in my life. So what you want to do, in an ideal world, I'd have an iron for this part, but if we use our imagination, this is our iron. We've all got irons, and they've all got a nice tip, a nice point. The first thing I do is use the tip of that iron to get right into that seam. You're not looking to press it over, you're just looking to push that seam all the way along that curve. Just follow that curve, and you'll see that naturally the piece starts to bend over. This is where I would then take the iron and put it fully on that seam. And I am an ironer. I'm not a presser. This is where I would be physically moving the iron like this to get that seam to lie as flat as I can. I'm also a great fan of, some of you may use it, flatter spray. It's just like a starch alternative. I would then do a spritz there, flip the piece over, and again, press on the back. And you can see, even without an iron, that seam now lies really flat, without any clipping, without any notching, without any matching of pins, without any basting in place. And then the same applies for however deep those curves are. So you can do quite shallow curves, you can do much deeper curves. The process is the same. Start with your strips right side up, cut the curve, take away your excess bits, bring them together. Remember, we want to match the curve. So I'm going to show you that bit again, because that's probably the most important. So if we cut another curve, if you're using solids, right sides up, this happens to be a Hoffman batik, so it's the same on both sides, so that's always helpful. So I'm just cutting the curve. And if your fabric moves, stop, take your rotary cutter away and adjust. If you have to stop, you can. So remember, we don't want to be matching the top. We want to be matching the seam. Even though it may look like that is wrong, it's not. That's going to help you sew that seam. And you can have really good fun with curves. So as mentioned, that I'm a huge fan of creating color gradients. So this quilt actually starts off sort of green and goes up to blues and purples. And what's nice is you can add little snippets of other fabric into the curves. So you could piece several curves, and the process is the same when you're cutting the first curve to when you're joining the curve to another piece that you've already sewn. So we would take a strip, if you imagine that was a bit longer, and we would just cut the curve. Some people like to follow the same line, so you've got a nice repetition of a shape. Other people, like myself, cut a different shape. Variation is key in improv, so the more subtle differences you can add will really make the piece. But if you want to add a little insert like that, it really is simply just taking a strip, take a strip that you want to piece in. Those would go right sides together. We would sew that seam. Like so, we would press that out. Pop the next background piece on. And you can see I'm very rough and ready, and my practice is like this at home on whatever quilt I'm making. I don't remove selvages or press my fabric before I use it, or pre-wash it or anything like that. I am a little bit rebellious in that regard, I would say. But that essentially is that. So you would press those seams out of the way, and you would use that in exactly the same way as a strip. So right sides together, cut the curve, and that gives you a nice little pop of contrast in there, which can help with, if you wanted to add, introduce a new color or create that sort of sense of depth. Again, it can be solids, it can be prints. And then what do we do once we've done these? So we talked about that jigsaw piecing method. You can use that for your freehand curves. You can cut into these. So you can cut these pieces down. So we could say, we'll cut this in half, and we'll turn it like that, and then we'll sew that to that. So you can piece these together in the same way that I talked about piecing these. Or what you can do is what I did for this particular quilt, is make them all to a similar size that they can then be trimmed down to. So I continued to add curved pieces until I knew I could get a 12.5-inch square from it. Cut them all down to 12.5, and these were then joined in a more traditional way with your rows, and then join your rows into the finished quilt. So it's entirely up to you and the look you're going for. But that's the versatility of improv. You can make it work for whatever project you're doing. You can even combine the two in one quilt. So you could join some units like that and then trim those down. You could even use a curved seam to join this to that. So there's lots of possibilities. What I would say is just grab some scraps. If you've been interested in improv quilting and you've kind of been a little bit worried about where to start or not quite sure what it's all about, just grab some fabric. That's the best thing you can do. Try and put away your ruler if you can. Just grab some scissors and just sew bits of fabric to bits of fabric, and then maybe introduce a curve or introduce a strip or something, and you'll soon find that it grows. And I've taught people who have never done improv before, and they have been bitten by the bug, and they've run with it, and they absolutely love it. So improv doesn't have to be completely without thought. There can be a thought process. There can be, conscious choices made in the piecing and the positioning of those fabrics, and it doesn't have to be scrap vomit. You can make conscious choices about your fabric and the placement of those colors to create this look. And I'm all about inspiration as well. So I take a lot of inspiration from nature, from architecture, all coming back from that first vegetable quilt that I made that was inspired by that leek. And I want to try and take these really obscure reference points, if you like, and try and translate those into fabric. So I've been inspired by nature, vegetables, gardens, the tally marks that we make when we count, shoals of fish, architecture, graffiti, just so many wide-ranging, sources of inspiration. So that would be my top tip, is to just go out, look up, look down, get inspired, grab some fabric, and kind of just let go of the leash of the traditional rules of quilting. I'm not saying, throw them away forever. They'll always be there, and it is important to know and recognize where quilting has come from. But there is a history of improv that goes way back to Welsh flannel quilts, to the Amish, to the quilts of the Gee's Bend. So improv isn't anything new, but it is sometimes intimidating. So hopefully you've all kind of seen that it's not too scary, and have a go, hopefully. Thank you all so much. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions or anything specific? No? That's a good group. Usually a hand shoots up and I'm like, no? Brilliant. So yeah, the book is Inspiring Improv. We're doing a book signing after this demo if you're interested. So the book is available here to purchase. It covers the 2 techniques that we talked about, as well as 4 others. So it's technique-based. I guide you through fabric selection, inspiration, where to find it, how I approach sewing, as well as 12 complete quilt projects to get you started. And I will be signing copies should you wish. Thank you all very much. Thank you.